On today's episode of Exclusive, we discuss Kazakhstan's financial landscape with Marcia Favale, who led the restructuring of BTA Bank, Alliance Bank, and Timir Bank. We'll explore the impacts of these actions, the success of the People's IPO program, and the role of ESG in Kazakhstan's financial sector. Join us as we uncover the lasting effects of Ms. Favale's efforts on economic stability and growth, and address the challenges and opportunities facing Kazakhstan's banking sector today. Ms. Favale, welcome and thank you for joining us on our program today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
You led the restructuring of BTA Bank, Alliance Bank, and Timir Bank. What were the immediate and long-term impacts of these restructurings on Kazakhstan's banking sector and economy?
You know, that's actually a very good question. But I have to bring you back to the financial crisis, just to give you a little bit of context. So imagine a time where all of the liquidity of the market pretty much ceased. There was what we call a liquidity crunch. And you had these banks failing because of that in the United States and in Europe. And when that happened, you saw that the capital markets seized. What does that mean? That means that the ability to go to market and refinance or raise money to help your financial situation was pretty much gone. So when I was asked to come and help with the restructuring of these banks, I took a look at it and I said, well, wait a minute. These banks are important, but the reason why they're failing had to do with mostly mismanagement and also aggravated by the lack of liquidity. So with the blessing of the government, I came up with the burden sharing restructuring, which was novel. It was the first commercial bail-in the financial history of the crisis. So much so, it's a benchmark. So what did it achieve in the first instance, in that moment of crisis? It achieved a couple things. It minimized moral hazard, so it didn't allow for other banks to turn around and say, you know what? I want to do the same thing. I'm going to say that we have NPL problems and I want the government to bail us out, or the market. So it stopped that. It kept money inside the banks for operations, so that people wouldn't lose money if they went to an ATM, people didn't have to call in the mortgages, so there was that ability to be functional. It also kept the sovereign rating, you see, because many of the investors and investment banks wanted for the government to go out and do a sovereign and take out the investors. And I said, but why? That doesn't make sense. If you're getting paid a fee and you have experts, and this has been going on for a long time, the government's not responsible for this. So let's sit down and do a restructuring that makes sense. That takes in consideration the moral hazard, keeps money in for operational reasons, doesn't affect the rating of the country. And during the crisis, we kept the sovereign rating. And through a lot of championing and a lot of conversations with rating agency investors, people ended up seeing that we were correct. So the immediate effect are all of those, plus we invited investors to be partners in the process and have a presence on the board so that corporate governance could get better. So the ability to keep BTA, Timir, and Alliance going during the financial crisis and not implode like Lehman's or other such, and having to burden the economy through government borrowing and then put that onto the people because there's a budget, then maybe they didn't have as much money for hospitals or schools or local transportation. I said no, they said no, we said no, and we created an international benchmark. The long-term ramifications of that is, you know, it's quite simple. It's that sovereigns have to realize that they have the ability to also dictate to the market and not just receive advice from the market, which is balanced, but there is a conflict of interest. If I'm an investment bank, I have you as a client, but I also have my everyday clients and those that are the people buying and selling the securities, the bonds, the equity I'm selling. I can't get them angry, right? I still want to do business with you, but you're not repeat. So that tension doesn't always favor the sovereign or the issuer. And so when you look at what the IFC wrote during the time that we got it right, when they were comparing all the bankruptcies, that one of the biggest differences that the government did employ independent restructuring analysts that understood the full value. Because remember, I came from the sell side. I ranked #1 at the time, managing director out of London for LATAM and CEMEA, which is regional. But at the same time, I ran money in hedge funds and portfolio management. So I understood the whole value chain.
Yeah.
And so it was very, very important to command that. And just incidentally, what's important for Kazakhstan as well is that it's a case study. There's actually a case study written at Oxford by Oxford professors,
Really?
PhDs at the time, talking about this case study. They teach this case study at Said Business School and at the Blavadek, which is the policy school. So being able to command your narrative, even facing the world, is important. Now, that was done astutely because we commanded the narrative design. We were always honest. We were always transparent. So when we talked to journalists, when we talked to PR, when we spoke to investors, it was always consistent because the framework was accurate, it made sense, and there was no reason for us not to have disclosure and best practice. But best practice doesn't mean you have to blindly follow what the markets say. You can create your own inroads. So I think that's the legacy of it.
What would have been the consequences if the BTA bank had not been restructured? Wouldn't it have been easier to just shut it down and, compensate individuals their losses?
You mean individuals, the depositors, or the investors?
Well, I guess, yes, I'm speaking on behalf of the depositors and the investors.
Well, let's go through that scenario. All of a sudden you have one of the biggest banks, a third of the total assets, immediately closing down. That panic would have spread at the time through all of the other banks. Because remember, there was exogenous forces coming into Kazakhstan, saying that the world is stopping their liquidity, everything's imploding in the financial sector, and if you had a big, immediate BTA implosion, that could have affected the risk premium for all the banks and the perception. What you don't want is a bank run. Because if you have an unmitigated bank run, what destroys banks is when you have bank runs. Yeah. That's why you have term deposits, right? You have some current, because they're always having to manage the difference between immediate, absolute demand and what's already employed. There's no bank really that I know of, speaking in general terms, that could survive an onslaught without government giving them money to honor everything immediately.
Right, yeah.
So I think that if we follow that, I think that the consequences at the time would have been dire for the economy, and the government would have had to come in and rescue it.
Well, you also devised and created the framework of the People's IPO
Correct.
program. How successful do you believe the initiative has been in the country in terms of influencing the local capital markets and benefiting Kazakhstani citizens?
So, the original idea of the People's IPO was different. The whole purpose of the People's IPO, and this was before the pension fund system consolidated, you had 5, was to allow the everyday person who's participatory in the pension fund system. So they have money coming in, it's being matched, and they therefore have savings, to participate in the privatization of state-owned companies. So the People's IPO's concept was, as you go in IPO, part of that IPO, part of those shares, should go into the pension fund system, and the people, rightfully, because it's their assets, not just some oligarch's asset, it's their assets. I'm very pro-people, because if you provide hope to people, you have political and economic stability and cohesion. And rightfully so. It's not a handout, it's actually theirs as well, to give them. And so it's better than the voucher system, because the voucher system, some smart person could have come and, we went through this before, right? And take it away and, accumulate wealth against them. Because it was would have been managed by professional portfolio managers, the people would have woken up, had a pro rata share, okay? And that would have grown, hopefully. And they would have something to give to their the grandchildren, buy a home. Hope propels. But whilst I was proposing the People's IPO and that was starting to get some movement, the pension fund system consolidated. So you want that kind of tension. You want that idea of having different portfolio managers competing, right? Because you get a better service when you have competition conceptually. And so I don't think it actually went to the fullest extent, because think about this. If the privatization had accelerated and had a good pipeline, because it's been piecemeal, agreed? You would have had a lot of shares, you would have people that have shares, and you could have actually created a more robust domestic capital market. Economies have to have resilience. And the only way you create resilience is if you create it internally.
Yeah.
So what do you need? You need domestic capital markets that are robust. You need a venture capital system. So you need private equity that's domestically led. You need to invest in entrepreneurship programs and projects in Kazakhstan. So the People's IPO, the framework, but the execution and the fulfillment of it didn't come to fruition. And that was a huge opportunity lost.
Why don't you think it led to fruition?
Well, one, because of the consolidation of the pension fund system. Two, we haven't had so many privatizations, IPOs, right? And you can see that, we don't have a really robust domestic capital market yet, right?
Yet.
So, and we don't really invest in entrepreneurs. I love to say this.
Unfortunately.
True, and I love to say this. Genius comes from anywhere. Genius can come from anywhere. The question is, are you listening? And the government has to create inroads, channels to listen to that next idea. And let's not focus on unicorns. Let's not focus on unicorns, okay? Because that's one at a shot. That's statistically, right?
That's quite rare, yeah.
But the everyday entrepreneur is someone that we need to invest in. And when you invest in that, when you create this idea of accepting risk and accepting failure and allowing people to fail upward, failure is a beautiful thing because it teaches you how to be best in your next endeavor. It's not something that you should hang your head down in shame.
I think it's quite welcomed in the US.
Yes, but it has to be welcome here.
I agree.
It has to be welcome here. Why not? You have brilliant people. You're not overpopulated. So you have room to be able to invest in people. So create inroads. So instead of always shopping the ideas from outside, why don't you cultivate some from inside?
What about the group of Air Astana companies going public? Do you think that's been more impactful in terms of, is that a more impactful example of an IPO?
I think it's going to be successful. I think that in tandem with not just doing the IPO, but also having the routes, I think they're going to soon go to New York and open up direct routes so you don't have to go through connections. I think that kind of opening of Air Astana will be welcome.
The IPO aims to make national companies more accessible to the general public. However, people perceive it merely as a change of ownership, without much tangible benefits. Do you think it has lived up to its expectations? So no, you say no, it hasn't.
No, I think more can be done. You need to engage the populace to understand what equity means, what it means to own equity. Why should I own equity? How does it trade? What should I look for? How do I gauge the value? There has to be financial literacy, not just for the privileged, not just for the educated, for the population. And the best way of doing that, and so the easiest way of doing it is when it's in a portfolio that you're mandatorily invested in, pension fund, and then you start watching, the NAV, you start watching the equity, and you start asking questions. You're hopefully provided with reports about performance, and you start engaging. So I think that financial literacy is always important, because if not, people have knee-jerk reactions as to ownership. So, but it's all stepping stone.
So these are the fundamentals that we need to have to make it more fruitful. How did the restructuring of these banks and the introduction of the People's IPO contribute to Kazakhstan's economic stability and growth?
Well, as I said, so the People's IPO could have done more.
Right.
So that's, I think we've answered that. I think the restructuring saved the government from writing big checks, saved the government potentially from having a investment grade downgrade. That would have been catastrophic, because what happens? If Kazakhstan had lost their investment grade, okay, so that's the price, the risk premium for every single issuer would have gone up. That's cost. So cost of funding would have gone up, and that would have materially impacted the performance of any company that was, one, looking to get financed from the outside, and it would have also increased rates domestically.
What are the lasting effects of your efforts on Kazakhstan's financial institutions and their global perception?
Well, so I think you're coming from the restructuring. The restructuring was acclaimed. So, for example, the IFC wrote about it. That's huge. I represented Kazakhstan at the Paris Club. The Paris Club is where the people that are focused on restructuring for sovereigns get together around the world. And at that time, it was actually hosted by Madame Lagarde, who was at the time the finance minister of France, and now we know her meteoric and amazing, you know what I mean, performance, right? She's now, running the ECB. And, the capturing of you could do something different and make it work really caught the attention of the world. This was acclaimed by the IMF, by the World Bank, by the Paris Club, by the IFC. So, the Financial Times couldn't stop writing about it, Bloomberg, Reuters. So it elevated Kazakhstan. Right? Do we still have NPL problems in the financial sectors? We do. This was not something that was going to change everything in the economy, but what's interesting to understand is that we need to spend more time diversifying the economy, okay? And that's why I talked about instituting a risk culture. Because if you institute a risk culture, then you're not so focused on the already established industries. And you can bring diversity. If you bring diversity, you bring resilience, and we go back to that whole conversation. So there's more to do. So you can't look at BTA, Timir, and Alliance as a panacea for everything.
Yeah.
It was an amazing start. From there, other conversations happened. The AIFC, for example, the People's IPO, or accelerating the privatization. But the ability to move and diversify. So it's not just privatizing. It's privatizing, it's great, but it's also creating the next generation here. There are geniuses walking around. Let's get them.
What do we need to do to institutionalize risk culture?
Well, number one, the people in power have to applaud risk and applaud failure. When I say failure, I'm not saying someone that's negligent. Failure. Every single unicorn has had people that have failed way before that. But we like to romanticize, everything you touch is gold. Not true. If you actually talk to founders who were able to create a unicorn, then you would see that there was failure all the way. And failure is learning, right? So that's a good thing. So I think that there may be some reticence about accepting failure. Should I invest in this person? Who are they connected with? What's the idea? And you also don't want people to usurp efforts. You need to let people breathe. You have to have a culture that allows more millionaires that are not related, not connected, and are different from the people that have power now. Those people are important. They should continue to participate in the economy. But you have to create the next level of multimillionaires. And you have to invite everybody to partake in that.
Since January 1st, financial institutions are now obliged to report on their ESG commitments or efforts. Given that this is a resource-light sector, do you believe that it would cascade, that the impact would cascade somehow into the resource-driven sectors?
So you mean ESG?
ESG.
So let's break down what that actually means, because I think there's some confusion sometimes about it. So we're talking about the environment, we're talking about social, and we're talking about governance, right?
We are.
So what's the impact of ESG in the country? And what should be the impact of ESG? And should we even care? I mean, we have extraction industries. Does this apply to us? I don't know. Should we only be focusing on transitional economies or, transitional finance? Oh, so let's stop. Why is ESG important? Let's go to the environment. Do you like buying bottled water?
I like filtered water. I drink it from home. No, I don't like buying.
So just think about this. Because there was an ESG in the past, we all have polluted water, and we have to filter, and we have to bottle. So we can pay for it, but not every person that is in a lower income cap. So we just made one of the most essential things out of abuse to the environment. Inaccessible. Okay, so let's talk, why is ESG important? ESG is important because it affects every aspect of your life. It's about sustainable agriculture. One of the big assets in Kazakhstan is agriculture, but we don't spend enough money in agrotech. Look at the Brazilian miracle. Brazil decades ago said, wait a minute, let me actually focus on agrotech. And many of the agricultural companies are not even public. Yet they are making billions of dollars in revenue and buying foreign companies. Okay? So agrotech, sustainable agriculture is extremely important, right? Infrastructure, smart infrastructure, extremely important. Housing, what kind of cement? There are better cements now. Resilience. You had an earthquake in Almaty, unfortunately. You have floods in the country. Climate change is affecting everybody. So when you think about ESG, ESG is about smart economics. You know, what is profitability, by the way? People get confused. They think profitability is only about quarterly earnings, stock went up, bonds, and et cetera. No. Profitability should take into consideration all of the indirect costs that actually take away productivity. So for example, when you have a lot of air pollution, you have a lot of people that have problems in their lungs. That reduces labor productivity. It increases healthcare costs for a government. When you have climate change, it affects GDP. So when you don't look at the environment and you don't have mitigating circumstances, you're actually shaving off GDP, gross domestic product, growth in the future. So it's not about a feel-good, it's about a necessity. Social cohesion. ESG would champion, for example, financial inclusion. We started talking about finance. Financial inclusion for the underserved. Community building. Bringing in people from the communities to participate. Physically disabled people. If they're mentally well, why can't you have a wheelchair ramp and have them do spreadsheets or do whatever else they have to do, interviews? It's about calling upon people to participate proactively and productively in the economy. What's wrong with that? So the concept of ESG, and you know what? And we talked about risk, right? And we talked about entrepreneurship. Let me just give you some numbers that I think that'll be really interesting about how ESG could be really, really impactful. The smart trash market, for example, waste is a big hindrance on governments. It right? Is. Okay. Just the smart global trash market, smart market, from composting at home with more like intelligent technology and et cetera, is $346 billion market. And it's growing at 15% CAGR, compound annual growth rate. Green technology is over $135 billion global market. It's growing at 29% compound annual growth rate. These are amazing marks. Sustainable AI. I know a lot of people say ESG and sustainability is yesterday's conversation. Yeah. It's all about AI. You can bring them together. That's a huge business starting now. It's 14 billion, it's growing 19%. You know what the exit multiples are? No. Huge. So for an early stage sustainable AI company, you can sell for 15 to 30 times EBITDA. Or if you're on the growth, 20 to 40 times. Renewable energy, 10 to 20 times EBITDA. This is a business channel. This is why I'm giving you numbers. Energy efficiency, 8 to 15 times EBITDA. Sustainable agriculture, 8 to 12. And if scalable, even higher. Waste management and recycling, 7 to 12 times EBITDA. It's worth investing in ideas within the ESG realm. So it's not just about, and it's important, green bonds for sure. Yeah. Like DBK issued some and others. Very, very fruitful. Sustainability bonds, very good. We shouldn't greenwash. That's always terrible. But there's also when you go down in investments, we look for private equity. Well, why don't we facilitate some ideas through these? Because there's a market to sell. And that would also go through AIFC probably, or CASI, or both. And so then here you are generating businesses, diversifying within the ESG agenda and providing a pipeline of the future for your domestic capital markets, calling in people to participate. It's a beautiful cycle.
Well, let me ask you, what returns should Kazakhstani companies expect from their commitments to ESG? And how do we protect them from underperforming? Is there a risk of underperforming?
There's always a risk. So in terms of the multiples, here we see that on average, it's anywhere between 10 to 20 times EBITDA, okay? 8 to 15 times EBITDA. So if your EBITDA is $1, you could probably cash out anywhere between 10 or 15 or 10 and 20. That's a huge return on your money. So imagine you invested $1 and you get back 20.
Yeah.
I'll take that every day, especially if you're doing good, right? Or you get back 10 from one. And so that's the kind of thing, because what would happen is a homegrown technology company in any of these spheres would look at multiples in the Western market. They would look at global multiples, which there are databases. And then when bankers got ready, they would say, okay, we look at here, discount it a little bit for Kazakhstan, but they would still have huge returns, right? And then you would create this venture capital business that is homegrown. And then you would actually spur people to think about human capital development, because capacity building is important. The country has to, provide capacity building. We're a little bit reticent about, closing down coal factories, because what do you do with all those people, right? And that is a legitimate concern. But there are technologies, even in the extraction and minerals, that help all of this production be cleaner. So when people think, if they think only about all these, completely new technologies, no, but within the existing industries, you can make it cleaner. You remember when people used to drive a car and there was terrible, you would see that plume of smoke coming out? You don't see that anymore. Why?
Filters.
Filters, combustion, everything is better, right?
Yeah.
So you can take the same industries and employ technologies that allow for ESG. But what does it mean, ESG? That allows us to breathe. That allows us not to have such warmer climates that are going to cause health problems, infrastructure problems. We're going to spend more money paving roads. We're going to spend more money in waste management. We're going to spend more money. Money can be used smarter. So everyone should be looking at that. And there should be more contests. There should be more individual school, university kind champion. How would you solve for this solution?
Companies have sweeping statements about their ESG commitments.
Sure.
How do we prevent greenwashing?
You know what? This is something that is affecting every country. Because some people in the beginning said, I'm green or I'm sustainable, and it was very lofty, it was very non-general. The world is coalescing into a definition. It's still not there, right? You have rating agencies that have an opinion, you have independent agencies that have opinions, but the world is coming together for a definition. We went from sustainable to green, right? You have subdivisions. The only way that we can make sure that companies don't greenwash is to consistently update and enforce frameworks and have independent verification. And that's important.
Considering Kazakhstan's energy mix and our current levels of emissions, do companies have leeway in terms of their compliance with ESG principles?
For sure. So let's go from the G part, governance. What is governance? Being more transparent, giving more disclosure, right? So governance, having more independence in decision making, independent directors, independent culture, so you can actually challenge hierarchy respectfully. Let's go on the S side, social side. Are you engaging women? Are you engaging disabled people? Are you engaging people, not so much here, but of different races, different ethnicities to come in, different ages? That's important, right? And then we go to the E part. As I said, there are technologies every day that can be employed in actual extractive industries or energy that we have right now that can make what they're doing just cleaner. So employ it. What's the big deal? Increase solar, sure. Gas, sure. Wind, sure. But the existing, you can still use coal, but you could use coal more efficiently. Yeah. So it's just applying that next stage of efficiency. And that, starts meeting ESG.
Currently, there are no ESG ETFs available on the Kazakhstan Stock Exchange. Does this indicate some lack of demand for sustainable and environmentally, socially responsible investment options in Kazakhstan?
Well, so let me give an example of DBK. The DBK issued 2 green bonds in the local market. One became certified, and one sustainability bond externally. There was demand. That was Kigak also did it. So there is demand, but there still needs to be an education. Just so you know, the ESG market generally defined, is an investment market of 22 trillion. So I want to repeat the word, 22 trillion. So it's there. The question is, does Kazakhstan want to listen? Because people are investing. It's 22 trillion. There are portfolios that have, gaps because they're looking for, opportunities to invest, not only in bonds, not only in equity, but also private equity. 22 trillion. In some estimates, growing to 64 trillion soon. We want to be part of that. It would be insane not to. You get to have lower funding, so why pay more if you can pay less if you're actually doing things? So for example, DBK, Development Bank of Kazakhstan, has renewable energy projects. So because of that, it can issue green finance. So no, I think there's an appetite. That you have agencies here, you have smart people behind a lot of these initiatives. So I think that it could further develop. But again, in addition to this, I'd like to see smart energy, I would like to see entrepreneurship in maybe the technology that inputs into that. Maybe how do you recycle certain aspects of that? So there is the ability to be smart. Why aren't we, creating energy cars here? Cars that run on energy, why not?
Have a piece of that pie here.
By investing in people. So there are enough intelligent people that you can recall back to Kazakhstan that have outdoor, outside, outmarket, outwardly experience that can come back if they had the right investment climate to bring their intelligence and experience here. That's why you have accelerators all through the United States and other places. There's a reason why the United States still has more unicorns. India is actually coming up with a lot of billionaires. But why? Because they invest in accelerators. They invest in an ecosystem for people to actually excel, to test their solutions to go. So we keep going back to this idea of funding risk, knowing you're going to lose. When someone does a private equity in their portfolio, they don't expect every single company to do well in the portfolio. They expect one or two that would compensate for all the others. And that's okay. That's how it's supposed to be.
Well, when do you anticipate the first ESG ETF to be available for Kazakhstani investors?
I don't know, but I hope soon.
How do you think that ESG in the financial sector would drive change in the rest of Kazakhstan?
Well, number one, on the social aspect, it should promote inclusive finance. Okay? So reaching finance to those that are underserved, that would be a requirement. 2, healthcare and education. We need to do a lot more about education, a lot more about healthcare. There are products out there that can take people from wheelchairs and make them more mobile so that they're actually exercising and not just sitting and losing muscle mass, and will feel like they can look you in the eye and not be looked down upon, like these slight changes that would bring them back into productivity. Education, again, as I said, not everyone needs to go to university, but maybe people should go to coding. Maybe people should go more to technical schools that are robust, but that also, if they have an idea, they can put it to test through an accelerator, through investments. Community building, increasing living standards, providing affordable housing. Now you can do modular housing in a minute. You can do 3D housing. There's no reason why people shouldn't be in adequate homes. And think about what adequate homes do. When you create adequate homes, you actually create health because sanitation's better. So people get there's less illness, less burden on the healthcare, and people have more, hopefully, love of their home, and then people spend more money into it, and then, it's a cascading effect. And in the environment, why aren't we, again, focusing on sustainable agriculture and, like I write here, renewable energy? It keeps coming up. We can do this. Why are we not creating data centers that help in AI? AI is growing. We need data centers. You need a lot of muscle mass for ML, machine learning, deep learning, and et cetera. Why aren't we investing in developing these things? Why aren't we investing, for example, in ESG, in hyper-local experiences? Why do we spend only money in big tourism, and why not more smart tourism, which is enabling local villages to accept people that come through more carbon-friendly manners?
Agricultural tourism.
Ecotourism, or what they call also, people that like to do pilgrimages or et cetera. So this is a big trend. I'm actually involved in that. And I can talk, not on this interview, but hopefully soon a little bit more about that.
So how can we alleviate fears surrounding ESG investments in Kazakhstan?
Education. People have to understand. People have to understand that everything worthwhile in life is trial and error. Everyone has to understand what profitability means. For a business or an endeavor to be productive, it has to have longevity. ESG is about longevity. It's about sustainable agriculture. So if you are doing a practice that brings down yields, how does that help people when we have food insecurity in the world? It's just logical. So agricultural sustainability in its practice, in its technology, improves yields. If it improves yields, what happens? In Kazakhstan's case, less import. Because remember, when you import anything, you're importing inflation as well.
Yeah.
So import substitution is something that the country has to keep focusing on stopping. Produce it here. Why not? Food security is a real thing. Sustainable agriculture, organic agriculture. Why do shortcuts in production, which in the future is going to cause diabetes, cardiovascular problems? Why? The government's going to have to pay. Is that smart? It's good for short-term investors because they get their money and run.
You're talking about GMO foods?
I'm talking about a bunch of different things.
Right.
I'm calling out a lot here.
Can you list them maybe?
There's some controversy over synthetic meats.
Right.
Okay. It's alleged that they have chemicals. It's alleged that's too soy dependent. And if you're too soy dependent, you're not rotating crops. And we can go on and on and on. I mean, that in itself is an interview. But so that's why I said sustainable agriculture is important. Let's think through these conversations, right? Because there's a difference between what an investor wants now. Okay, they do have to get a return. But then you also have to look at the legacy of that. Is it profitable in the future? There are countries today that if you took the air pollution and water pollution and all of the environmental damage, their GDP would be negative. So how is that smart?
Yeah.
They say that, a certain amount of pollution for P2.5 can actually shave off 0.8% of your GDP. There are some estimates that say that if the United States continues the way it is, that climate change, i.e. the warming of 1% of Celsius, can actually, in low-income countries over the century, shave off up to 1.5% of GDP, and higher, a half. So it's not just about, people are complaining about heat. No, heat causes issues even in infrastructure. You're going to have to change the way you pave roads. How do you look at road technology, smart technology? So even industries that are old and seen, I've seen roads, I know highways, that can be improved. Tires have to be more ESG efficient. Why? Because we're hotter. The pavement makes things hotter.
The world is changing.
So do you want to keep buying tires? Do you want a tire that has the technology to withstand that? And so less tires, less problem, right, with dumping and recycling. So it's smart business. It's smart business. And that's what makes sense.
What do you perceive as the most significant challenges currently facing the banking sector in Kazakhstan? And what measures would you recommend to address them?
I think that first, NPLs. We always have to work through those. Two, I think that the financial institutions in Kazakhstan would benefit from a vibrant domestic capital market because they can do more investment banking. They could also create that kind of capital. So then now you're creating a whole new business that's more robust. And again, we go back to, investing in private equity in the country, in homegrown entrepreneurs or homegrown opportunities, even if they're here. So if you have a more vibrant domestic market, you can, manage risk better. You can actually have a diversified set of revenue. You can also create recurring business opportunities. you have a higher engaged human capital, capacity building accelerates. People will keep money in here rather than taking it outside. If you don't have opportunities here and you have high NPLs in real estate or in other areas, wealthy people are going to invest their money outside of the country.
Right.
Don't we want the money back? So where are they going to invest? Investment has to be a continuously focused on agenda so that there is opportunity not only for the money that can't leave to stay, but stay and become more productive. There's a multiplier effect of money. Okay? A tenge is just not a tenge. If it keeps moving, it's actually worth more.
Yeah.
So you need to have that multiplier effect, and on top of that, you have to have opportunities that bring money back in. You know, Brazil did that. Brazil, when I started investment banking, a lot of the brain trust of Brazil had left and were working in New York and in London, for example, and they were staying there. But when it started to change, around Lula's time, when it started to change, where the brain trust of Brazil, educated in the Western world, they're Western world, but I'm sorry, like United States and in England, and working for the top investment banks or private equity firms, when they started seeing opportunity, and there was a huge boom economically in Brazil, people went back. So people got what they learned working in New York and in London, they brought it back, created their own private equity funds, they created their own investment banks, they came back and created their own companies. And so there was this great economic rebirth and diversification. There was a bubble in credit, yeah, that happens, it's cyclical, but it expanded. At one point, I think that, if I'm not mistaken in my data, Brazil almost rivaled the UK in GDP growth.
Wow.
And how big it was. There's a reason that California, think about that, is, its economy is comparable to an entire country.
Wow.
So, human capacity building, the want to stay home or come back home and contribute to the economy affects everything.
So do you think we should use Brazil's and California's case studies as a case study for Kazakhstan?
I think that one should always look at different examples of success and adopt them to your country and to your reality.
Right.
And if you're looking at agrotech, obviously Brazil is one of the leaders. Just don't look next door. Look at South America. Look around. Just don't depend on America.
Right.
Look around. Look around. And then invest in your own people. And be okay if it doesn't work out the first time. But you need to create a generation of entrepreneurs, cutting-edge entrepreneurs. Because maybe the coal miner that's losing their job in the future maybe has that child that makes up for it by being a success as an independent or as an entrepreneur.
Well, and on that note, I'd like to thank you for being with us on our program today.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you.
Having you.
Oh, it was a pleasure being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.